welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something really crucial for spaceflight safety, but maybe not always front and center. Flight abort rules for launch vehicles.
Exactly. And we're leaning heavily on the FAA's advisory circular AC 450.108-1 for this.
Right, that's the FAA guidance doc.
Yeah, it basically gives commercial space operators a roadmap, showing how they can prove they meet safety regs using flight abort as a hazard control.
So if you've ever watched a launch, seen that rocket heading up, and maybe thought, just for a second, what if something goes wrong? What are the backups? This deep dive is definitely for you. We're going to try and break down the core ideas behind these really important rules. Make something that seems pretty complex, hopefully surprisingly understandable.
We want to cut through the jargon, right? Give you a clear picture of how the public and also critical assets on the ground are kept safe during these launches.
Which are amazing, but let's face it, inherently risky.
They are. And like we said, our main source is that FAA advisory circular, AC 450.10081. It covers defining hazard zones, the tech specs for the safety systems.
That's pretty comprehensive.
It is.
Okay, so our mission today, pull out the really key stuff from this AC about flight aborts. Why do we have these rules? What are they trying to do? And what are some of the big considerations when setting them up?
Think of it as getting the essentials without having to wade through the whole dense document yourself.
Exactly. So let's just dive right in. Why flight abort? Why is it so fundamental?
Well, it's a primary way to control hazards. It's especially critical when you think about limiting really bad outcomes, high consequence events in places we don't control uncontrolled areas.
Like populated areas, presumably.
Precisely. The AC actually puts a number on it. If a potential vehicle failure could lead to what's called conditional expected casualties, CEC, greater than 1 × 10⁻³
Okay, that's 1 in 1,000 chance of a casualty given a failure.
Right. If the potential is that high or higher in an uncontrolled area, then a flight abort system is generally going to be required.
Okay, that CEC metric sounds key. So if the risk hits that level, you need that emergency stop capability, like an eject button, sort of.
Yeah, that's a decent analogy. And the main point of that eject button, the flight abort, isn't primarily about saving the rocket or the mission, though operators might want that too. The AC really hammers home that the primary objective, for regulatory purposes, is protecting the public and what they call critical assets on the ground.
Public safety first. Makes total sense.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned safeguards for people on board. That can be a factor, but the rules we're discussing today, they're focused squarely on ground safety.
Got it. And when these rules are set up, it sounds like clarity is just non-negotiable.
Oh, completely. The AC stresses that these abort rules have to be defined super clearly before the flight.
Before anything leaves the ground.
Yes.
Yeah.
That includes all the critical parameters, the things being monitored, and the specific quantitative criteria, the numbers that will trigger an abort.
So no guesswork involved.
None. And if there's a human in the loop for the decision, which sometimes there is,
Right.
then the exact process they follow, and crucially, any potential time delays in that process, those also need to be spelled out and accounted for.
Okay, so it's not just if you abort, but exactly when, based on clear data and how that decision happens, including any human reaction time. Now, the AC talks about the flight safety system, the FSS. You mentioned tech specs. Do the requirements for this system change?
They do. It's directly tied to the potential consequences of a failure. Again, using that CEC metric.
Oh, okay.
If the potential CEC is higher, specifically greater than 1 × 10⁻², so a 1 in 100 chance of a casualty in an uncontrolled area given a failure.
That's a pretty significant risk level.
It is. And in that case, the AC requires what it calls a highly reliable FSS. This system has to meet some very specific demanding standards.
Okay. Higher potential consequences demand a more robust, more reliable safety system. Makes sense. What if the potential CEC is lower, but still, not zero?
Right. If it falls between that 1 × 10⁻² and the 1 × 10⁻³ level we mentioned earlier, then you need what's called a safety critical FSS. It still has requirements, but they're different from the highly reliable ones.
Okay, so tiered requirements based on risk.
Exactly. And interestingly, there's a bit of a procedural option. If an operator decides to just go ahead and use a highly reliable FSS anyway, even if the risk might only demand a safety critical one.
They go above and beyond.
Yes. If they do that, the AC says they might not necessarily have to do that detailed CEC analysis just to figure out which level of FSS is required. Choosing the higher standard can sometimes streamline that part of the compliance process.
Huh. That's an interesting trade-off. Invest more in the hardware up front, potentially reduce some of the analytical workload. Okay, so we get why we need aborts
Hmm.
and the systems involved. Let's talk about the triggers themselves, these flight safety limits. What's their main job?
Their overall goal is basically prevention, preventing a whole bunch of bad stuff.
Like what?
Well, the AC lists things like preventing any increase in public risk compared to normal flight, stopping the vehicle from flying weirdly, anomalously overpopulated areas.
Keeping it away from people if it goes off track.
Right. Also preventing those high consequence events we talked about, and even making sure you abort before the vehicle's condition gets so bad it might actually break the flight safety system itself.
Okay, so setting boundaries, basically. Keep it in the safe zone. The AC mentioned something about preventing anomalous flight using conditional limits. What are those? They sound important.
They are, especially for orbital missions. You can think of them maybe as gates or checkpoints in the sky.
Aids.
Yeah, if critical vehicle data performance, trajectory, whatever, goes outside the expected norms, or if it looks like the mission just can't succeed safely before the rocket gets to a point where a failure would pose a much bigger risk.
Like flying over a city? Or before it's actually stable in orbit?
Exactly that. If those conditions are met before that point of increased exposure, the conditional limit, or gate, requires an abort.
So it's a check. Is everything still okay before we enter a riskier phase?
Precisely. And a really key parameter they often look at for orbital missions is the ability to actually make it to a stable orbit, specifically an orbit with a perigee, the lowest point above 70 nautical miles.
70 nautical miles. If it looks like it won't reach that minimum altitude.
Then that's often a trigger for one of these conditional limits. Abort the flight.
Got it. So ensure mission viability and safety before overflight or before orbital insertion. What about stopping those really high consequence events directly?
Right. Another goal of the limits is ensuring the act of aborting itself doesn't cause a high consequence event that's CEC greater than 1 times 10 to the minus 2 in uncontrolled areas.
Wait, so the abort command itself shouldn't make things worse?
Essentially, yes. The safety action shouldn't create a disaster. However, there's a clarification. This specific constraint doesn't necessarily apply if the failure has already kind of limited the consequences before the vehicle strays too far from the plan.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Say an engine fails very early while it's still climbing out over the ocean, far from land. Aborting then might just mean debris falls in the ocean. That's different from a failure later on, maybe closer to land, where the timing and method of abort could significantly change where debris falls.
Okay, so the context of the failure matters for that rule. Now, you also mentioned aborting if the FSS itself is threatened.
Yes, that's another layer. Limits should also trigger an abort if the vehicle's maybe it's shaking violently, experiencing extreme temperatures, whatever could compromise the FSS before a trajectory limit is actually hit.
So if the environment gets too harsh for the safety system.
Exactly. If it exceeds the operational environment the FSS is designed for, like vibration limits or G-loads, that could be grounds for an abort. You need to protect the protector, basically.
Protect the protector. I like that. Make sure the safety net is still there if you need it later for a trajectory problem. Now, there was this containment alternative mentioned. What's that about?
Ah, yes, containment. This is an option primarily for operators using that highly reliable FSS.
A top-tier safety system.
Right. Instead of doing all the detailed consequence modeling for various failures, the goal with containment is simpler, conceptually at least. You have to demonstrate that the hazard footprint where debris or other bad stuff could land from any credible event, even assuming the FSS doesn't work.
Even assuming total FSS failure.
Yes. You have to show that footprint will not impact any uncontrolled area, period.
Wow, okay. So you design the mission and trajectory so that even the worst-case failure stays within a safe, controlled zone?
That's the idea. It can reduce the burden of complex consequence analysis. But, as the AC points out, it's not always feasible.
Why not?
Well, think about launches that have to fly over populated land masses to reach the desired orbit. Achieving total containment in that scenario might be impossible or incredibly restrictive on the mission design. It works best for very remote launch sites with clear downrange paths over water, for instance.
Right. Much harder if your flight path takes you anywhere near civilization. Okay, so those are the goals and alternatives. But setting these limits isn't just arbitrary. What are the major constraints you have to work within?
There are several really key ones. First, the limits have to account for all the potential hazards throughout the flight.
All of them. Like what?
Everything from debris falling, obviously, but also potential explosions, any toxic materials being released, even things like far-field blast over pressure, the shockwave effect at a distance. It needs a really comprehensive look.
Okay, so a full hazard inventory. What about losing contact? Like, if the tracking data disappears?
Critical point. The AC calls this the duration of acceptable data loss, or DADL.
DADO. Okay.
If you lose the tracking data, you need to monitor the flight against the abort rules. A countdown timer starts.
Good timer.
Yep. And if you don't get that data back before the timer runs out, boom, automatic abort.
How long is the timer?
It varies. It depends on things like how long the total flight is supposed to be, what the vehicle was doing when the data dropped out. It's calculated beforehand.
So it's tailored to the situation.
Exactly. The goal is to balance the risks. You don't want to abort a perfectly good flight just because of a momentary data glitch.
Right.
But you also can't afford to let a vehicle fly blind if there is a serious problem developing that you just can't see anymore.
So the DADL timer is set to expire before the vehicle could potentially drift into danger unseen.
Generally, yes. Before it could violate a position limit or reach a point where the mission's basically failed anyway, or have its potential hazard footprint creep into an uncontrolled area without you knowing.
That sounds like a really tricky balance to strike in real time.
Yeah.
What about the delay in the system itself? You detect a problem, you issue the command, but things take time, right?
Absolutely crucial. That's latency or time delay. There's always a lag between when a rule is technically violated and when the FSS actually does its thing, destroys the vehicle, or terminates thrust, or whatever the action is.
And that lag comes from?
Hardware response times, software processing, communication delays between ground and vehicle, and potentially, if a human is involved, their decision-making time. All of that adds up.
So you have to build that delay into the limits.
You absolutely must. The flight safety limits, the trigger points have to be set early enough so that even with that latency, the abort action is completed before the actual dangerous condition occurs. You have to anticipate.
Set the boundary further back, effectively, to account for the reaction time.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And the reliability of the FSS itself is a constraint, too.
Yes. The risk assessments have to look at both scenarios. The FSS working as planned, and the possibility that the FSS itself fails when called upon. Okay, so you analyze the risk if the abort works, and the risk if the abort fails.
Correct. Now, interestingly, remember that containment alternative with the highly reliable FSS? If an operator goes that route, under one specific part of the regulation, they might not need to do that detailed analysis of the consequences if the FSS fails, because the whole point of containment is that hazards are contained even if it fails. But overall risk still needs assessing.
Got it. And a really big one you touched on earlier. The abort action itself shouldn't make things riskier for the public.
That's a fundamental principle laid out in the AC. Flight safety limits must be designed such that activating the abort never increases the overall risk to people in uncontrolled areas compared to just letting the errant vehicle continue flying.
Which sounds obvious, but probably has big implications for where you draw those lines in the sky.
Huge implications. It might mean, for example, you wouldn't trigger an abort over a certain area if the debris pattern from the abort itself is calculated to be worse than letting the vehicle fly a bit further, maybe over a less populated area, before aborting. It's complex analysis.
Wow, okay. And one last constraint. What about trajectories that are off nominal but maybe still okay?
Right. The AC says that any flight path the vehicle is allowed to fly, even if it's deviated a bit but is still considered on a useful mission trajectory, must still meet the overall acceptable collective risk criteria.
So minor deviations might be tolerated if they don't significantly increase risk.
Potentially, yes. If the vehicle, say, launches on a slightly different heading, but that new path is still within acceptable safety bounds and can achieve the mission, you might not trigger an immediate abort. It allows for some operational flexibility within the safety framework.
Okay, we've got the goals, the constraints. Let's get practical. What do these flight safety limits actually look like? What kinds are commonly used?
The AC mentions several common ones, things like maximum altitude versus downrange distance limits. Basically, tracking if the vehicle is climbing as expected along its path.
Like drawing a ceiling on a map?
Kind of, yeah. And also fixed termination lines, often based on the instantaneous impact point, the IIP.
IIP, that's where it would land if thrust stopped right now.
Exactly. So you draw lines on the map based on IIP calculations, saying if the predicted impact point crosses this line into an unsafe area, you terminate.
Okay, geographical boundaries based on real-time prediction.
Right. And similarly, minimum altitude versus downrange distance limits, ensuring it's staying high enough as it travels outwards.
So ceilings and floors and geographical lines, pretty intuitive. Are there less common types?
Yeah, a few others get mentioned.
Hmm.
Moving termination lines where the IIP line isn't fixed but shifts based on the vehicle state. Azimuth limits, which constrain the direction, the compass heading of the flight path.
Keeping it pointed the right way.
Flight path angle limits, controlling the angle of ascent or descent. Sometimes fixed minimum altitude limits specifically for controlling vehicles that might be tumbling or falling after a failure.
To ensure they break up or impact safely.
Potentially, yes. And even optical tracking systems, sometimes called sky screens.
The eye screen, like literally watching it.
In a way, yes. Especially near the launch pad during the very initial ascent, it can be a visual system, sometimes with operators, providing an independent check in those first critical seconds when maybe radar tracking is still locking on.
An extra set of eyes, basically.
Right.
Okay, so we have these different types of limits. How do those conditional limits, the gates we talked about, fit in with these?
Good question. Those conditional limits use these physical limit types, but they're applied at specific points or phases. The AC describes different geometries for how they're set up, depending on the mission and where populated areas are.
Geometries.
Yeah. For instance, one setup might have a conditional limit, and if the vehicle passes that gate successfully, maybe there are no further flight safety limits needed because the plan is to disable the abort system before orbit anyway.
Okay, so it's a one-shot check before disabling.
That's one possibility. Another geometry is setting up a conditional limit around an uncontrolled area that the mission flies near or over, like an island. The gate checks performance before reaching the island.
Makes sense. Check before you fly over.
Right. Then there are scenarios where the uncontrolled area, say a large country, is wider than the vehicle's possible sideways drift. You might need conditional limits before, during, and after crossing that area.
Multiple checks for extended overflight.
Exactly. And of course, you can have mixed scenarios combining these approaches. It's very tailored to the specific flight plan and the geography involved.
It really sounds like a customized safety plan for every single launch, considering the unique risks. And with all this complexity, making sure it actually works must be paramount. Validation.
Oh, absolutely critical. The AC is very clear. The flight abort rules and the systems that implement them have to be rigorously validated. Through lots of testing simulations, hardware tests, software verification, and detailed analysis, you have to prove they work as designed under all sorts of conditions.
No assumptions allowed.
None. And crucially, you also have to show they don't accidentally increase risk. Plus, operators need to demonstrate one of two things. Either that the limits contain hazardous debris within a safe zone with high confidence.
Like the containment idea.
Yes. Or, if containment isn't used, they need a numerical risk analysis showing that activating the abort results in equal or lower risk to the public compared to just letting the flight continue on its failed path.
So prove it's safe, either through containment or through risk math.
That's the bottom line. You have to demonstrate the safety case robustly.
Wow. Well, this has been quite the journey into a really intricate but obviously incredibly important part of making spaceflight safer.
It really has. And you see how these FAA rules, this AC, they're not just red tape. They're the bedrock for protecting people and property as we launch more and more.
Definitely. I found that whole idea of conditional limits, those gates, really fascinating. Setting up decision points before you enter a higher risk phase.
It's a smart way to manage risk proactively during ascent.
Yeah. And that whole DADL thing, the data loss timer, balancing the need to act against the risk of aborting a good flight. That really drives home the complexity of real-time safety decisions.
It absolutely does. And remember, we've really just scratched the surface here. The full advisory circular goes much deeper into the analysis methods, gives specific examples.
It's a dense document for a reason.
It is. So if you're interested in digging into the real technical weeds of spaceflight safety, we definitely recommend checking out the full AC 450.108-1.
And we'll put links to the FAA resources in our show notes, make it easy to find.
Good idea. And, thinking of the future, with launches getting more frequent, more diverse mission types, private space stations, lunar missions.
Yeah, the landscape is changing fast.
It really is. It raises a pretty big question. How will these flight abort rules need to evolve? How do we keep ensuring safety, adapting these principles, while still allowing for all the innovation happening in the commercial space world?
That's a huge question. Maintaining safety while enabling progress.
It's the central challenge, I think, for spaceflight safety going forward. Something to definitely keep thinking about.
A really thought-provoking point to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.